All right. Good. People can hear me in the back. Yes. Good. Okay. Talk to me right. What is right? What does that even mean? Does it mean just talking to people in a respectful way, making sure that you're polite whenever you're interacting with them? Or does it mean keeping your cool whenever something goes wrong? And this is software, so we know something is always going to go wrong. Well, no, it's actually more than that. It's communicating in such a way that it's effective. So whether you're trying to bring some new technology into a project, you want to explain a design decision, or you want to talk about a failure, being an effective communicator and talking to people right, it's all connected. But this is not always easy to do because we have to work with stakeholders, testers, developers, product managers. All of us come from different backgrounds, and we also have different perspectives on what right means when it comes to software. But just because it's not easy, it doesn't mean that it's impossible. So today, I'm going to cover 12 of my top tips for making sure that you talk to people right. Now, this slide means that I would like a little bit of audience participation. So just to start off really easy, how many people here are developers? Okay. Testers. Good. Be proud, right? Okay. Product managers. Okay. Do we have any designers? Oh, that's awesome. Okay. I think I covered everyone. Or business stakeholders. All right. Great. One business stakeholder. Thank you. There's something here for everyone in these tips. So the very first thing that you have to do is establish relationships. Now, as humans, we care so much about the intent behind some interaction with us. It's actually part of our survival as a species. So if we don't have a relationship with someone, our very complicated brain will automatically assume that this person has bad intentions. So every interaction we have with our coworker turns into this like potential backstabbing moment because we don't really know this person. So what can you do instead, right? You sit down and you get to know people a little bit better, but not in a creepy way where you want to know about long walks on the beach. More like, so how did you get into technology? What is it that you're working on right now that you're super passionate about? Getting to have more common ground with our colleagues. And even if you work in a distributed company, you can have these remote conversations with each other. One thing I really love is that I have a few people on my team who do virtual coffee chats. It's only 15 minutes. They're across time zones, but they still take the time to get to know each other better, and it helps us have closer relationships with each other on the team. There's also just hanging out around the water cooler. Now, this is a very American thing to do. I notice here I don't really see a lot of water coolers. So it could also be the teeny tiny coffees that you drink or some tea. Whatever it is, just get together and have these more informal conversations that don't put a lot of pressure on you. I also really like having a water cooler channel in Slack. So I work at a distributed company, and we just post random GIFs and photos, and it kind of helps us to have some camaraderie with each other. On to tip number 2. You should have some clear guidelines, and this is really important because every single thing we do in life has a guideline, whether you like it or not. So we have road signs to protect us on the road, we have food standards to protect what we put in our bellies, and we even have banking standards to protect our money. And I'm sure we've seen the negative effects when people try to disregard these standards. So these standards are so important because they serve as a baseline for decision making. When you're developing software, you know that there are chances something is going to go wrong. So instead of actually pointing fingers at each other, you can just point to the documentation. For instance, do you have a clear workflow for what it looks like to release your software to the public? Here's an example flow that kind of mimics what we do at my company. So we go from planning a feature all the way to coding, pull requests, CI checks, regression, and then we're done, right? But no one would go and say, for example, do a code review if we know it hasn't passed the CI checks, because that's not part of our process. So think about your company. Is there a known process, and then is it documented? It helps to avoid ambiguity. Now, there's this really popular saying in English about what happens when you assume. And if you're not familiar with it, it kind of involves a donkey, and you can also ask me after the talk. But the underlying principle is that making assumptions can cause us to come to the wrong conclusions. So instead of assuming that people will just know how things are done, that's just how we do it here, you should document things that are really important to you. So for example, what are some things that you can document? One thing we document is how we do our daily stand-ups. We're a distributed company. We use a Slack bot in order to do our stand-ups. And at first, new people would just join, and we thought they'll read the other stand-ups and they'll know how to do it. But that's not what happened. People just put all kinds of things, chatting with someone today, meeting with people later. Well, that doesn't really give us a lot of context, and that doesn't help us to know whether or not you're blocked on anything. So we decided, okay, look, let's come together, let's document what a good stand-up looks like for us. And now, when we onboard new people, this is part of the onboarding process. Here's another example, ticket estimation. Like, it's some kind of black magic voodoo on how each developer has a different perspective on how long it's going to take to deliver a feature. So we decided, all right, let's put some documentation together for how we do it here on our team. And then just one final example from the data analytics team is, how do you do a data experiment? What does it look like? What is the structure? And so now we have some consensus, and everyone can do it the same way, so that it's more valid when we look at the results. But ultimately, documentation takes a lot of time, and to be honest, in our day-to-day, people don't always go back and read the documentation. So that brings us to tip number 3, which is use automation. So think about it. We already know that if we have some sort of repetitive task, then we can automate it, and that will help make things easier for us. But you can also use automation to help you avoid needlessly offending others. So let's look at an example. This is a pull request diagram from Alex Hill that I really love, where she breaks up the 4 quadrants on where comments can fall during a pull request. So you may have things that are low conflict, high reward, like security. No one gets offended if you point out a security issue in their code. Or you could have things that are high conflict and high reward, like design patterns. But this last quadrant right here, low reward and high conflict, this is the quadrant where we can try to automate things, like white space or typos. So let's say we have this code right here. And we open a pull request with this code. We worked so hard. It's part of a larger feature set. And then this is the first comment we get. That's it. Right? So what happens in your mind? It's like an explosion, because you think, oh, this is some tiny part of a whole feature set. Of course, I know how to use constants. I've been developing longer than they have. And it turns into this big emotional thing that it didn't need to be. Whereas if a bot told you the same exact thing, you go, oh, yes, I should use a constant. You fix it, and then you keep moving forward. So this is part of the benefit of bringing automation into your team to help just avoid having these sort of contentious situations, especially when it comes to pull requests. You can even use CI/CD tools to help make sure you don't forget steps. So earlier, I showed you what that workflow looks like for us when we release a new feature. This is something that I've been using recently, Code Magic, to do our Flutter app releases. And it's really nice because I don't have to go back and think through all the steps. It's just going to run my tests, make sure integration tests pass, and even deploy it to the test users, so it's really nice. And I saw this talk from Joe Birch at Buffer called Automate Everything. It was really well done, and he introduced a library called Danger to show how you can further add automation to your release workflow, and I highly recommend it. Also, these slides are already available online. If you follow me on Twitter, you can get access to them just in case you feel like I'm moving too fast for you to capture it. Great. So can you think of at least one thing in your team's process that you can automate? Maybe it's something that was a little touchy, people got a little heated over it. Just spend like 30 seconds, maybe jot it down, type it down, and think about, okay, this thing, we could probably automate that. And then make sure you follow up with it after the conference. You thought of it? Good. Tip number 4, use templates. So templates help you to have consistency and clarity among the members of your team. For example, here's a pull request template that I like to use. It helps reduce confusion for the reviewer as well as the author. One thing we used to have on our team specifically is that people would forget to push the strings. So our app was localized, and maybe they would forget that step. So here you can see this is an example of a completed one. And then you just kind of go through the checklist as the author and make sure you've done all the key things that need to happen. And the checklist kind of helps reinforce what you already know. Now here's a quote from this book, The Checklist Manifesto. And yes, I just travel with books all over the world. And on page 160, it says, just ticking boxes is not the ultimate goal here. Embracing a culture of teamwork and discipline is. So some people are really afraid to use checklists. They think it makes them seem like they're not as competent, but it's the complete opposite. Having a checklist enforces discipline and makes sure that the very obvious things are always done and out of the way. And then as developers, we can focus on the big picture things. So maybe moving to bug reports. So maybe you've seen a bug report like this from QA before. It's like a one-line description. The app crashed unexpectedly. And if they were feeling super generous, they probably included a picture. So that's when you put on your detective hat, and now you have to start trying to figure out, okay, what were you doing when the app crashed unexpectedly? Does this happen on all versions of Android, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And then you tend to have a contentious relationship between the QAs and the developers. But instead of that, you could use a template. It already outlines what's the expected results, what was the actual, and what are the steps to reproduce. So now you have something that you can work with, and you don't have to go through this whole needless back and forth between the developers and the QA. Personally, I really appreciate it because I go between applications and sometimes features, and I don't have that same mental model of the code base in my head anymore when a bug comes in. So when I have a bug report that's very clear, lists out all the steps to reproduce, I find it very, very, very helpful. Okay, tip number 5, be explicit. Say exactly what you mean and leave no room for confusion. So why can this be tricky at work? Well, depending on where we're from in this great big world, the way we communicate can be very different. Some people tend to communicate in a way that's very implicit, where the listener has to read between the lines to figure out exactly what they mean. Let's take one simple example. So here we say, hey, this bug just came in, it's high priority, can you take a look? Okay, sure, no problem. 2 hours later. So where are we with this bug? Is it fixed? No, I haven't started on it yet. I was finishing some other task. What? The first person is totally confused. They don't understand why it wasn't already started and fixed at this point. So what are some things that you could do differently to be more explicit in your communication style? Well, first of all, define what high priority means for your team. So my high priority may not be the same as your high priority, so we need to get on the same page with that as a team. If we say high priority, that means within the next 30 minutes. Okay, great, we all agree, let's keep moving forward. Next, give some time constraints. So if I waited 2 hours to find the status of the thing, I could have said, within the hour, can you please let me know if you were able to reproduce the issue? Also, check for understanding. Hey, this is high priority. It's blocking the release. So this is very important, and we need to get this done this morning. Does that make sense to you? So somehow you are being extremely explicit when you communicate. All right, tip number 6, make liberal use of questions. So since we're not mind readers, the only way we can actually figure out what someone is thinking is to ask them the questions. And often we'll just make assumptions about someone's motives without taking the time to ask clarifying questions. So if we come back to our example on pull requests, let's see how questions can help us to communicate more effectively. So first question, why did we want to do this here? So that includes us or you as the reviewer in the discussion, and it doesn't make it personal. We just want them to see, like, look, we're in this together. I care about the code the same way that you do. Here's another variation. Can you explain the motivation for this change? Like, don't assume there's some nefarious reason that they decided to refactor a class that you wrote. Just ask them, why'd you change it? Also, I really love this one. This line confuses me. Is it meant to cue the work? So we're focusing on the code and not the person. We want to find out why is the code this way, and it helps people to take our critique and pull requests better. You can also apply this to when you're having a one-on-one between a manager and a direct report. Just a couple of questions here, like what skills would you like to develop right now? Don't assume. Do you feel we're helping you advance your career? Maybe you're having a lot of churn in your organization and you want to know, okay, what's the reason? Could this be a reason that people don't feel that they have a clear path to advancement? Or what are you working on that you wish you weren't? So I asked my report this question a couple of months ago, and I learned that there was a particular task she was assigned. It was very manual. She actually really super hated working on it, but just didn't say anything. So we sat down, came together, thought of a way of automating it, and now it's even a better user experience. But I would have never known if I hadn't asked the question. So questions can be super powerful. So far, we've seen half of the tips, these 6, about relationships, guidelines, automation, templates, being explicit, and using questions. And as I mentioned, the slides are all available. So let's move on to tip number 7, read before clicking send. So I'm going to read this as Karen to Jeff, right? So my third request. Jeff, this is my third request for your feedback on the latest designs. I need to know if users are going to be trained on the verification process before I can proceed. Designs attached, Karen. Now, if you were Jeff, do you think you'd be happy to get this email from Karen? How might you feel? Annoyed, frustrated? You might even completely ignore it and force Karen to send a 4th request. You just wouldn't be happy to get it. So what can we do? Let's just remix it, right? We'll start off with the subject. First, action needed, final agent verification designs. Maybe Jeff is the kind of guy who gets dozens of emails every single day, and he mostly just ignores them because he doesn't know that he needs to take action. So we could be upfront with it in the subject line to let him know, hey, I need you to read this one and respond. And then next, we can just make it more informal, right? Hey, Jeff, this is what we're doing. Do you know this? If you're not the right person, can you forward it along? And then we throw a little emoji in there. It's more informal, and it's just small things that can make a huge difference in how effectively your team communicates with each other. And then there's Slack. Slack totally can complicate communication because the rules on instant messenger tend to be different from the rules of email, but the same principle applies. You should read things before you just quickly click send on Slack. So here's an example. We have 2 people, they were involved in this like Kermit GIF exchange, then all of a sudden one shows up and it's just like, hey, I need you to do some kind of work, right? So one of your code changes broke CI, can you fix it? This person's like, hey, we were just sharing Kermit GIFs, and then all of a sudden, boom, this is what you put to me in Slack. Instead, it's more words, but hey, look, the CI is down for the app, so we're giving the person some context. I've been able to track it down to a recent change. Yes, it was their change that broke it, but we don't have to call it out. We just say, like, here, they'll know that they did it. Would you be able to take a look? Here's the reason why. Thanks. Emoji, right? So just throw emoji in there to have friendlier conversations. Tip number 8, have powerful meetings. Collaboration is so essential for companies to do their best work, and meetings are still the go-to way to do it. Now, whether or not you need to have a meeting is a totally different question, but if you do have meetings, then you should make sure everyone gets the most out of it, and you don't have tons of people who just sit in the meeting, still coding and still checking their phones the whole time. So I like the POWER approach. It's an acronym. It stands for purpose. So why is this meeting necessary? If it's not necessary, then you shouldn't have the meeting. Just send an email with a nice email, though. Outcomes. What's the deliverable for the meeting? Is there going to be a set of action items? Are we making a decision? What is the outcome? What's in it for them? If I invite 10 people to my meeting, why are each of those people in the meeting? What are they going to learn that's going to help them to get their job done? Or what is it that they're going to do to contribute to the success of the meeting? Engagement. How can you get everyone involved in the meeting, either before, during, or after, so that it's not just 2 people talking to each other the whole entire meeting in a room full of 7? I hate when that happens. And then finally, roles and responsibilities. Who's going to keep the meeting on time? Who's going to take the notes? And who's going to make sure we actually handle the action items? When you do this kind of power approach to your meetings, then they're guaranteed to be more successful. So just as a quick meeting agenda, it takes maybe like 10 minutes. You can say quickly, what's the purpose? What are the outcomes? And then here's the agenda. So everyone knows what to expect before they show up to your meeting, and it's more likely to be engaging for everyone involved. So by making use of the power approach, then you can keep people engaged and you can have meetings that are actually useful and effective. All right, tip number 9, use data for objectivity. One common issue I see a lot on agile teams is that they overcommit to features. So sprint after sprint, they overcommit and underdeliver. But when you bring it up, people don't want to hear it because they feel like every single sprint, I'm working so hard, I'm executing, and I am delivering features. So what can you do to change the conversation? Show some data, right? So you can look and say, okay, here we go, week after week. This is what we committed to as a team, but this is what we actually delivered. Now, let's talk about what we can do to get better. We're making it about the data and not necessarily about people's feelings. Here's another issue. Maybe you have knowledge silos on your team. So sometimes maybe lots of private messages in Slack. People are too afraid to talk in public channels. What can you do? Pull the data and just show them. Here's our conversations on Slack. 98% of them are in private messages. Does anyone have any ideas for what we can do to get better at this? Why do you feel more comfortable talking in a private chat versus in a public chat? When you show people data, they're more likely to say, oh, okay, this is real. Okay, yeah, let's talk about it. But even though we want to use data, it's not everything. You still want to let people share their feelings. So we don't want to have one group of the team is all about the data, and everyone else is like, I hate this, and we just ignore them because of the data. That's not what we want to do. I mean, I'm the kind of person that's like, show me the data. Give me the charts, the numbers, the more, the better. But over the years, I've realized that that's not good enough. To be a really good leader, you actually have to care about people's feelings and their frustrations. And sometimes those things that aren't quantifiable are valid and can help improve the way your team communicates. So how many people here work with someone who's based in another country? Okay. 5 to 10%, it looks like. Well, the next tips are kind of related to remote work and working with people from other cultures, especially people who maybe don't speak your language as their mother tongue. So tip number 10, simplify your language. We're not like professors, we're software developers, so we don't have to be like super fancy and try to show off when we're communicating with each other, especially when we're writing documentation, because that really just slows down the process. So let's look at an example. And this is from Jira. It's loved and hated by many, but it can mean like unexpected changes are coming your way. So here we are, this description field. People end up being super confused and frustrated when people like overdo what happens here. So there's a lot of text, and if you're feeling ambitious, like feel free to read it. But when I read it, I just go, why? Like, why would you put so much information, so many complicated words to explain something that ultimately is really simple? Like, take a picture and then crop it. Okay, so it's shorter, simpler, it's more effective, and that's the kind of thing that you want to constantly think of when you are writing anything that you will share with others. So what can you do, especially if you work with someone who doesn't speak your language as their mother tongue? Try to use shorter sentences, use everyday words. I have a few people on my team who speak very little English, so sometimes if we use like everyday words, it's easier for them to get a proper translation from Google Translate. Avoid local idioms, assuming everyone knows your local jokes and everything that you're super familiar with. So on my team, we had someone from a small town in Russia. We were playing this game, and we had to list out 5 things that we all had in common. So some Americans and some Russians. So we got together, and someone's like, yes, Star Wars. We've all seen all the Star Wars movies. That's what we have in common. And then the team from Russia was like, no, I've never seen any of those movies at all. And it just taught me a really valuable lesson. Not that people hate Luke and, in Russia, more or less that you can't just assume that your coworkers know your whole little background and your local jokes and everything, because they may not, especially if they're from a totally different culture from your own. Okay, tip number 11, use visuals. So if we grab our improved feature ticket from here, we could put some pictures in it, and it just makes it slightly better. So we have a before version where there's some stuff in the background, and then an after where there's nothing. It just really helps the person to understand, what does this feature look like? What does good really look like for this feature? And here's another example. We have a list of criteria for when someone is allowed to take a certain action in our app. So we just go through and we're like listing it all out. Boom, 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 boom. Well, wouldn't it be much easier if it was in a tabular form? You can make sure that you cover the different edge cases, and you can make sure nothing is missing. So it takes a little more effort to think, okay, this communication that I'm doing right now, would this be better as a visual, and what way could I display it visually? But it's totally worth it in the end. So on to our last tip, and that's to learn about others. So just spend some time learning about the people on your team and their backgrounds and how they like to communicate in a business setting. Okay, so there's a really great book on this called The Culture Map, if you're curious, and it covers 8 different dimensions on how people communicate in business settings. It talks about how those people with low context versus high context, so the people who like to make you read between the lines versus people who always say it like it is. It talks about how people make decisions. In some cultures, everything has to be a group decision. We decide as a group. Other cultures, they want one person to make the decision and then just like pass it down through the line. Also, the way we build trust at work differs according to culture. And I found this one super interesting because the US and Nigeria are on complete opposite sides of the spectrum when it comes to building trust. So the US is task-based trust. It's like, I trust you because in the past you've demonstrated that you know how to do great work. Whereas Nigeria is more relationship-based. We have lunch together, we go out for drinks, so I trust that you'll do your work because we're friends. So how can you bring those two cultures together to effectively have trust? So it's just about getting to know people and letting people get to know you. When I first started to work with some of my team there in Nigeria, I was initially really frustrated because I felt that I wasn't getting the answers that I wanted. People weren't responding to my emails on time. And then I flew to Nigeria and met the same people, and it was a totally different experience. It was so friendly and welcoming. We ate lunch together every day. And now, when I'm sending emails, I get back the response. So just real life, I can see an example of how my communication style and how I like to build trust with people was not in line with how they like to build trust with people. So in general, just knowing about how people like to communicate can really help you be a more effective person because you can start to adjust your style to suit the needs of others. Now, believe it or not, we've made it through all 12 techniques for improving communication on your team. And some of these things are going to take a little bit more time up front, but it's totally worth it in the long run as you start to watch people communicating better, start seeing your code ship faster, and stop having as many clashes between individuals on the team. So since we don't work with only robots yet, as long as we're still going to talk to other humans, we might as well do it right. Thank you.